Rejected by her children, she decided to enter the crater. But what she found down there. When the children left that afternoon, Mrs. Clementine stood still in the middle of the living room for a long time, staring at the wall, unable to move a single muscle. It wasn't sadness yet. It was that thing that comes before sadness, that silent shock that makes the world feel like it's spinning slower than it should. Brian had spoken in dry words, without beating around the bush as if he were solving an inventory problem. "Mum, the land isn't producing anything anymore. It's been 3 years with this drought giving no break. We can't hold on to this place. You need to accept it." And Valerie, who had always been the softer of the two, stayed quiet this time. She just stared at the floor, like someone who had rehearsed that silence. Mrs. Clementine was 75 years old, hair nearly all white, hands that carried decades of work and a stubbornness that Mr. Arthur Henderson, her husband, always called a virtue on good days and a punishment on bad ones. Mr. Arthur had passed away 6 years ago, and since then she had managed that piece of land alone with the help of Caleb, the oldest grandson, who lived in a small room out back and didn't talk much but was always there. What Brian and Valerie wanted was to sell everything: the land, the house, the old corral, the rusty tools. They wanted to put their mother in an upscale assisted living facility in Philadelphia, one of those with a pretty garden and photos on the website. They had even already picked one out. They had even already arranged a price with a buyer, and they had done all this without telling Mrs. Clementine beforehand. They showed up on a Tuesday afternoon with papers in hand. She didn't sign anything. She asked for 2 days to think it over, but the way Brian folded the documents and shoved them back into the folder showed he didn't think he'd need more than 2 days. When the house was empty, Mrs. Clementine picked up the wooden staff that leaned against the back door, the same one Mr. Arthur used when he went to inspect the land, wrapped an old cloth over her shoulder, and left. She walked without hurry, with that steady step that the drought still hadn't managed to take from her. The ground was cracked everywhere, brown and grey, without a single green leaf in sight. The sky had that leaden colour that doesn't promise rain, only promises to wait longer. She headed toward the crater. No one knew exactly when it had appeared. Caleb was the first to see it about 3 months ago when he went to check a fallen fence. He had found that opening in the ground, long, deep, dark, as if the earth itself had split in half with a sigh of exhaustion. About 50 feet long, maybe more. No one knew the exact depth because no one had gone close enough to see. The neighbors said the drought was cracking the subsoil, that the ground was giving way where the water table had dried up. Mrs. Mabel, a neighbor for nearly 40 years, had told Mrs. Clementine to stay away from there. "A cracked earth like that is telling you it wants to be left alone, Mrs. Clementine." But Mrs. Clementine never paid much attention to warnings. She stopped at the edge of the crater, leaned forward with both hands on the staff, and stared down. The ground inside was dark, full of broken stone, exposed roots hanging from the walls. But there was something strange. On one side, the wall of the crater wasn't just dirt. It was worked stone, cut stone, like an old wall, nearly buried, that the crack had exposed after decades. Mrs. Clementine recognized that stone. Mr. Arthur had told her when they were still engaged that his grandfather, a man named Thaddeus, had built the first family house right on that piece of ground, long before the land was divided, long before any of Thaddeus's children were born. Over time, the house had given way, been buried by a flood, and then covered with earth. No one knew exactly where it was anymore. Mr. Arthur had looked for it once when he was young, but never found it. Mrs. Clementine looked at that ancient stone and felt something she herself would have struggled to put into words. It was as if the ground had opened not by accident, but to show something that had been waiting to be seen. She walked around the edge of the crater slowly, moving from one stone to another with her walking stick, until she found the side where the inner wall formed a kind of natural step, an uneven but possible descent for someone who was careful and unafraid. She was 75 years old. She was afraid of many things, but not of that. She began to climb down. Look, I had to stop here for a moment, because some people, when life pushes them, sit down, and some people, when life pushes them, climb down into a crater with a walking stick in hand. There's no rational explanation for it, it's just who they are. The descent was easier than it had looked from above. The side she entered was slanted, with protruding stones that served as handholds. She went slowly, testing each step before putting her weight on it. The floor of the crater was stable, smooth stone with a thin layer of dust on top. When she reached the bottom and raised her eyes, she saw what the stone wall had hidden. It was an opening. Small, low, about the size of a curved door, like a very old stone arch. Half of it was still buried, but the crack had shifted the ground on one side and opened a passage. Mrs. Clementine bent down and went inside. Inside it was a small, suffocating space smelling of old earth and stale air. She stood still while her eyes adjusted to the dark. The light coming through the opening was enough to see the essentials, and what she saw took her breath away in a way the entire descent had not. In the right corner of the space, still on a stone base that must have been a table or a shelf, there was a rusty tin box the size of a shoebox, with its lid dented but closed, and around the box, hanging on the walls by a wire that time had turned red with rust, there were tools: a small sickle, a hammer with a short handle, and a thick wooden frame, its glass shattered, but with a photo still visible behind the shards. Mrs. Clementine approached the photo with her heart in her throat. It was an older man in a dark suit standing next to a seated woman. The photo paper was stained and eaten at the edges, but the man's face was clear enough. She recognized the eyebrows. She recognized the square jaw. It was Thaddeus, the grandfather of Mr. Arthur Henderson. She had seen his portrait once, on a crumpled sheet of paper that Mr. Arthur kept inside a prayer book. Her hands trembled a little as she reached for the tin box. The lid resisted, rusty and tight, the way only time knows how to tighten. She used her walking stick as a lever, slowly, until the lid gave way with a dry snap that echoed in that small space. Inside the box were folded papers, some yellowed and fragile, others more resilient because they had been protected by the ones on top. And there was a small notebook with a black hardcover bearing the initials TH embossed on the front. She picked up the notebook with both hands and held it as if it were something alive. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Clementine didn't read anything inside there. The darkness wouldn't allow it, and her eyes weren't what they used to be. But she closed the tin box, tucked it under her arm with the care of someone carrying a child, and went back through the stone opening into the brightness of the crater. She climbed up just as she had climbed down, slowly, testing each stone, the walking stick in front. When she stepped onto the flat ground above, she stood for a moment just breathing. The sky was still that grey without promise. She walked back home with the box under her arm and a firm thought in her mind. She needed Caleb Henderson. Caleb was 26 years old, Brian's son but with Arthur's heart. He had stayed on the land by his own choice, long after the others had left. He was a quiet young man, with few friends, who understood the land like few of his generation did. When Mrs. Clementine came in through the back door and set the box on the kitchen table, he was sitting with a glass of water in his hand. "Grandma!" He looked at the box, then at her, and didn't need any further explanation to understand that something big had happened. "You're going to have to help me read this," she said, sitting down slowly in the chair across from him. Caleb moved closer. He opened the box carefully. He took out the folded papers first, the sturdier ones, and unfolded them one by one on the table. The first ones were old receipts, store accounts from an era of silver certificates. But the fifth paper he opened was different. It was a more formal document written by hand in small, careful handwriting. Caleb read silently for a moment, then looked up at his grandmother. "Grandma, this is a deed." She said nothing. She waited. "It's an old deed, handwritten, but with a notary's signature and everything. It registers the land in the name of Thaddeus Henderson, and, by direct inheritance, to any blood descendant who remains on the land for more than 10 consecutive years." He paused. He read it again. "There's a clause here that says the land cannot be sold as long as there is a direct descendant living on it permanently." Mrs. Clementine closed her eyes for a second. Arthur had never mentioned that clause, or he didn't know, or he knew and had forgotten it in a drawer of memory, along with everything time buries. "Is that still worth anything?" she asked. "I don't know, Grandma. It takes someone who understands the law to say, but it looks serious, and look here at the bottom. He pointed to a line at the end of the document. There's a notation made later in different handwriting. It says, "Registration confirmed at the County Recorder's Office, Book 4, page 211. It has a date." She opened her eyes. "So there is a record?" "It seems so." They stared at each other, Caleb with that expression of someone beginning to understand the magnitude of what he holds in his hands. Mrs. Clementine with that expression that 75-year-olds have when life confirms what they have long suspected. That patience has a price, but it also has a reward. But there was still the notebook. Caleb picked up the black-covered notebook. He opened it gently because the pages were thin and time had weakened the binding. The handwriting inside was Thaddeus's, the same as in the document, small and meticulous. It was a diary, or something like a diary, scattered notes, not every page dated, some short like memos, others long like letters. Caleb read aloud to his grandmother, pausing at words time had erased. And it was in one of those middle pages, in a note that seemed to have been written in a hurry, that they found the other thing. Thaddeus wrote about a spring, an underground water spring he had discovered while digging the well for the first house, the house now buried beneath the crater. He described the location in detail, using references from the land, the direction relative to the morning sun, the distance from a large rock that must still be there. And he said that the spring had never dried up, not even in the harshest years he lived through. I don't know about you, but when Caleb read that part out loud, I got that chill of someone realizing a story is turning upside down. Mrs. Clementine sat still. If the spring still existed, the land wasn't unproductive because of lack of water. It was unproductive because no one knew where to look, and if no one knew where to look, it was because the map was buried along with Thaddeus's house. Until that day. Caleb was already on his feet before his grandmother said a word. "Grandma, I need to go back there. With a flashlight and a tape measure, I need to check the references he gave here." "Tomorrow morning," she said, "with good light." He agreed, but neither of them slept well that night. Brian Henderson called the next morning before 7. He asked if his mother had thought it over. He said the buyer needed an answer by the end of the week. Mrs. Clementine listened calmly, said she needed one more day, and hung up before he could finish his sentence. Caleb left early with the flashlight, the tape measure, a shovel, and the notebook wrapped in a cloth. Mrs. Clementine went along, slower, reaching the edge of the crater when the sun was already low on the horizon, but the light was still good. Caleb went down alone this time. He stayed inside for almost 2 hours. Mrs. Clementine waited, sitting on a flat rock at the edge, with the cloth over her shoulder and the staff firm in her hand, doing nothing but waiting. She was good at that. She had learned from Mr. Arthur Henderson that there are times when the best work you can do is to wait without despairing. When Caleb came back up, his face was smudged with dirt, and he was breathing hard, but his eyes were bright. "Grandma, there's water down there. I can hear it. It's not a hallucination. I put my ear to the rock where he indicated, and you can hear it. And the rock is damp. On a dry day like this, a damp rock can only mean one thing." Mrs. Clementine closed her eyes. Then she opened them. "Now you call your father," she said. Caleb blinked. "To say what?" "To say we need to talk. You, me, him, and Aunt Valerie. Here, tomorrow." Brian didn't like the summons. He said there was no need for a meeting, that the decision was already made, that his mother was being stubborn just for the sake of being stubborn, not for any reason. But Caleb said, with that calm firmness that reminded everyone of his grandfather, "Dad, you're going to want to hear what we found. I promise you." They arrived the next day shortly after noon, Brian in a dress shirt as if coming from a meeting, Valerie in flip-flops and a loose blouse, with that tired expression of someone already prepared for another fight that won't end well. Mrs. Clementine served coffee without ceremony and placed the tin box on the table. Brian looked at the box like someone looking at a trap. "What's that?" "The history of this land," Mrs. Clementine said. Caleb explained everything, where the documents had come from, what the deed said, the inheritance clause, the spring. He opened the notebook to the page with Thaddeus Henderson's note, pointed out the references, described what he had heard, and touched down there. Brian was silent for a time that felt longer than it was. Valerie read the document twice, then a third time. When she looked up, her eyes were teary, but not in the way Mrs. Clementine expected. It was a different kind of crying. It was the crying of someone realizing she was about to do something wrong. "Brian," she said to her brother slowly, "we didn't know." He didn't answer immediately. He kept his hands flat on the table, staring at the document as if it would change if he waited long enough. "This needs to be verified," he said at last. "We need someone who understands the law." "Of course it does," Mrs. Clementine said, "and it will be verified. But I want you to look at me now and tell me something honest, Brian. If this spring exists, if this land can produce again, do you still think I need to leave here?" The question hung in the air. Brian was a 53-year-old man who had spent his life making quick decisions and justifying them afterward. But there are times when life doesn't let you do that. There are times when the answer needs to be slow. "No," he said, soft but clear. "No, Mom. If the land still has something to give, you stay." Valerie placed her hand over her mother's hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks who are just starting out. Now, continuing. In the weeks that followed, things moved in a way Mrs. Clementine had never experienced before, fast and slow at the same time. Fast because Caleb went after who he needed to, found a professional who understood land, took the documents for verification at the nearest county recorder's office. Slow because each of those steps involved waiting, uncertainty, days when Mrs. Clementine woke up at 4 in the morning and just stared at the ceiling, wondering if she had dreamed it all. The document was legitimate. The registration existed. The clause was old and had a kind of validity that required a more detailed check, but the professional they consulted said it created, at the very least, a serious complication for any attempt to sell without Mrs. Clementine's consent. Brian Henderson cancelled the deal with the buyer. The spring was confirmed by someone Caleb brought from a neighboring town, a man who understood ground drilling and who went down into the crater with equipment and came out saying there was water, yes, and that with the right work it could be accessed. The work was done over 2 months. It wasn't cheap. Brian and Valerie each covered half, without Mrs. Clementine having to ask. She thought that was worth more than any value they could put on the land. There's something I keep thinking about when I get to this part of the story. The land was cracked from drought, the family was fractured from disagreement, and it was the crack in the ground that showed the way to what was underneath in both cases. Sometimes what seems like the end is just the shell that needed to crack open to show what's inside. The day the water came up through the new pipe installed in the backyard was a day Mrs. Clementine couldn't hold back her tears. Caleb stood by her side. Brian was there too, and for the first time in many years, he didn't have papers in his hand, no hurry in his eyes. Valerie came with the little children, and the kids ran to get wet without really understanding why their grandmother and the adults looked like they had just received an unexpected gift. Mrs. Mabel came over from the neighboring property, just in her slippers, and stood at the edge, watching it all. Then she looked at Mrs. Clementine with that look of someone about to say something, but already knowing it doesn't need to be said. "You went down into that crater," she said. "I did," Mrs. Clementine confirmed, "and I thought you had lost your mind." "Maybe I was a little," Mrs. Clementine said and smiled. The land took another 2 months to start responding. The soil was exhausted, dried out in layers that don't fix overnight. But with proper irrigation, with care, the first seedlings sprouted on a Thursday afternoon, small and green in a sea of grey and brown. Caleb called his grandmother to see, and she crouched there in the dirt, hands dirty up to the wrists, looking at the tiny leaves with the same expression grandmothers have when they see a newborn grandchild. Thaddeus's notebook was kept in a new box inside the house, along with the deed. Mrs. Clementine read every page with Caleb's help over several afternoons. There were stories about the old man that she would never have known otherwise, Stories from when the land was new to the family, from when life was even harder, but there was a kind of clarity in everyday life that she recognized as the same thing she had always tried to pass on to her children without being able to put a name to it. There was a note near the end of the notebook that stayed with her in a special way. Thaddeus had written, "The land holds no grudge. It dries, it cracks, it tires, but if you don't abandon it, it won't abandon you." She read that line aloud about 3 times, to Caleb, to the walls, to Mr. Arthur Henderson, who wasn't there anymore, but who somehow she still felt close by when she was quiet enough. Brian Henderson came back a few more times after that. Not every week, but he came back. Sometimes without warning, showing up on a Saturday morning with a bag of groceries and spending the day helping Caleb with something on the land. He didn't talk much about what had happened, but he was there, and for Mrs. Clementine that carried a weight any words would have trouble bearing. Valerie Henderson was different. She talked. One afternoon, when the 2 of them were alone on the porch, she looked at her mother and said, "Mom, I regret it. I knew you didn't want to leave here, and I stayed quiet because I thought we were being practical. But being practical without listening to someone is just a fancy way of not respecting them." Mrs. Clementine looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she put her hand on her knee and said, "You're here now." Simple as that. The way only people who have suffered enough know how to be simple. The crater was still there. Nobody closed it up. Caleb had an idea to turn the opening into something. Maybe an improved access way for when they needed to check the water system down below. Thaddeus's buried house became a topic in the family, a story that Valerie's children wanted to hear again and again, that underneath Grandma's land there's a very old stone house with a diary and an old photo. Mrs. Clementine would go to the edge of the crater sometimes, at the end of the day when the light turned that golden color that makes everything look both older and more beautiful. She'd stand there with her walking stick, looking down into that opening that had changed the course of everything. She wasn't a woman of many words with herself, but in those moments she thought something she never told anyone, that Mr. Arthur Henderson always knew. He always knew that land held more than it showed, and that maybe he had left Thaddeus's story sleeping down there on purpose, waiting for someone stubborn enough to go to the edge, look inside, and go down, and that only she would be that stubborn. End of the story. 75 years of life is not a short time to learn that land and people have something in common. They both hold more than they show on the surface. Mrs. Clementine went down into a crater at 75 with a walking stick, alone, after being rejected by her own children. And down there she found water, roots, and a story that no sales document could erase. Now tell us, do you think Brian and Valerie did the right thing by changing their position, or do you think they should have listened to their mother from the start? Leave it in the comments, I read everything. Also, tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing. Thank you so much for your company today. Don't forget to hit like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this one.